The morning light came through the east window at a low angle, the way it does in late September at altitude, and I stood at the kitchen counter of that cabin looking at 3 small bottles arranged in a row beside the soap dish, and I could not move. Not because of what I saw, because of how it was arranged. 2 steroid drops on the left, 1 antibiotic on the right, caps forward, labels facing out. Exactly the way Darlene used to set them. I had been putting those bottles wherever I happened to set them down, because she was not there to arrange them, and I had not bothered to develop a system of my own. 3 weeks since the surgery, 8 months since she died, and those bottles were arranged the way she would have arranged them, by someone who had been watching long enough to know the difference. Pepper was sitting beside me on the plank floor, and she was not alarmed. She looked at the bottles the same way she looked at everything she had already decided was safe. That old dog trusted what was out there in the trees more than I did. Maybe she knew something I was still working out. To understand how I got to that kitchen counter, I need to take you back to the week before, when I drove up that mountain road with my dog and a bag of prescriptions and no particular plan beyond getting through the days, one at a time. I want to be honest at the start. I am not a man who tells stories like this. I carried a rural mail route in western Montana for 31 years, and I know what bear sign looks like, and I know what deer do in the pre-dawn, and I have a healthy understanding of what the woods contain. I do not lean toward the inexplicable. What I am about to tell you is what happened, and I have sat with it for the better part of a year, trying to find a different accounting, and I cannot make it work. My wife Darlene died on a Tuesday in January, 8 months before this story takes place. We had been married 44 years. She was not sick in any way that announced itself. She sat down at the kitchen table with her coffee, and she was gone before the ambulance reached our road. The doctor said the stroke was fast. I held on to that. I still hold on to it, even though I'm aware it was said to comfort me rather than to give me information. The house after that was too large, not in square footage. Our place was a 2-bedroom ranch house on 3 acres. Nothing remarkable, but every room had a dimension to it I had not noticed when she was filling the space. And after January, it was like living inside something that had lost its original purpose. I kept doing the things she used to do, because if I stopped doing them, I would have had to acknowledge that there was no reason left to do them, and I was not ready for that. I made 2 cups of coffee every morning for 6 weeks before I stopped. I set the table for 2 for longer than that. The eye drops when they came home with me from the cataract surgeon's office in late August were the newest version of that. She had managed my first round of drops after a minor procedure 4 years earlier, organizing them in her exact way. 2 bottles on the left and 1 on the right, caps forward, labels out so I could find them without fumbling. She had explained the arrangement to me once, practical as she always was, and I had listened the way you listen to your wife explaining something you do not think you will need to know. But I knew it. I knew it the way you know a lot of things you absorbed from a person who is no longer there to demonstrate them. After she was gone, I did not arrange the bottles that way. I just set them where they landed. It felt too deliberate to copy her arrangement, and also it felt like the kind of copying that would hurt more than it helped. June called me every Sunday, our daughter, who lives outside Missoula and teaches 4th grade and who inherited her mother's instinct for quiet management. She would call and ask how I was doing, and I would say, fine, and she would say, that was good, and we would talk about her kids for a while and then hang up. She was worried. I knew she was worried. I could hear it in the careful way she did not press me, the same way you hear the effort it costs someone to hold a question back. I did not give her anything to work with because I did not have anything to give. The cataract surgery had been scheduled for over a year. Left eye first, then the right eye 3 weeks later. Darlene had driven me to the first one, in the September before she died, and we had planned to drive together to the second. That appointment got rescheduled twice during the winter while I was handling the funeral, and the paperwork, and the strange new administration of living alone. And by the time I went in for the second surgery, I drove myself there and back, and sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes before I started the truck, because it seemed like the kind of thing I should have had someone with me for. That was late August. 3 weeks of twice daily drops, morning and evening. The discharge paperwork was specific. I kept it on the counter beside the bottles. Darlene's family cabin was 90 miles northeast of our house, up a Forest Service road off a paved county highway, gaining about 2,200 feet of elevation before it leveled out at a meadow where her grandfather had built the original 2 rooms, sometime in the 30s. Her uncle had added a kitchen and a sleeping porch in the 60s, and the whole structure had been winterized enough to be habitable through October, though not reliably past that. Darlene had gone up every September for as long as I knew her. She would stay 4 or 5 days, walk the ridgeline with whatever dog we had at the time, pick the late huckleberries, come home smelling of wood smoke and pine resin. I went with her some years and stayed home to work others. After she died, I did not think much about the cabin until August, and then I thought about it constantly, the way a person circles something they need to approach. I packed the truck on a Thursday. Pepper watched me from the porch steps the way she had watched me pack for things her whole life, patient and accessorial. And when I picked up her water dish, she got to her feet without being told. She was 13. A black and white border collie mix with a mostly grey face and one ear that had never stood up the way the other one did. Darlene had found her as a pup in the parking lot of a feed store in Polson, and she had been Darlene's dog in the deepest sense of the phrase, which meant she had been sleeping on Darlene's side of the bed since January, and I had let her. We got to the cabin around 2 in the afternoon. The road up had been rougher than I remembered, the ruts from spring runoff still pronounced, and I had taken it slow. The cabin was closed up tight, the shutters over the 2 front windows, a good half-inch of dust on the porch boards, a spiderweb across the door latch. I spent an hour opening things up and sweeping and carrying in the food box and Pepper's bag and my own. I set the eye drop bottles on the kitchen counter without thinking much about placement. I put a log in the wood stove and got it lit, and while the cabin was coming up to temperature, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee and watched the meadow and the tree line. The mountain across the valley had gone orange and red at the top, the larches changing first the way they always do, and the light at that elevation had the particular quality of September in the northern Rockies, thin and clean and slightly melancholy. Pepper lay at my feet and put her nose on the boards between her paws. We sat there together for a long time. The first day and night were uneventful. I slept better than I had in months, which surprised me. The altitude and the quiet and the fact that there were no chairs in the cabin that I had ever sat in with Darlene, no rooms that held the shape of her the way the rooms at home did. I did my morning drops standing at the kitchen counter, read a few pages of a book I had brought, ate oatmeal. Ordinary things. The wood stove made a small ticking sound as it cooled. Pepper napped near the door. The second day I walked out to the meadow and a little way up the ridge trail, which was as far as my knee was willing to go. My right knee has been unreliable since a fall off a loading dock in 2014, and the trail from the cabin to the ridge had a particular stretch of loose shale that required good footing. I went as far as the first bench above the cabin, which is a flat opening in the lodgepole with a view back down to the meadow, and I sat on a boulder there for a while and looked at the way the cabin looked small in all that space. Pepper had come up ahead of me and was working the edge of the tree line with her nose, which was normal for her. What was not normal was that she stopped at the far edge of the bench and stood still with her head up for a long time. Not the posture of tracking a squirrel or a grouse, but the posture of something she was sorting out at a distance. I watched her. She did not growl. She did not come back to me. She just stood with her nose working toward the upper timber. And then, after a while, she came back and sat beside me as though she had reached a conclusion. I did not know what to make of it. I noted it the way I noted things on my mail route, as information that might eventually mean something, without assigning it a meaning yet. The second night, I heard something outside after dark. I want to be careful about how I describe this because I am aware of how easy it is to retrospectively load a sound with significance it did not carry at the time. What I heard was a single, dull impact, the kind of sound a large piece of wood makes when it lands on packed earth. I lay in the bunk and listened. Pepper was on the floor at the foot of the bunk and she lifted her head and I could hear her listen too. And then she put her head back down. I took that as a reasonable sign that whatever was out there was not producing alarm in an old dog who had been alert to threats her whole life. I went back to sleep. In the morning, I found nothing that accounted for the sound. I walked the perimeter of the cabin, looking at the woodpile and the porch and the shed where the tools were kept. Nothing out of place. I decided it was a branch coming down from one of the taller larches at the north end of the cabin site, which happens in September when the bark beetles have been busy, and the standing dead wood starts to let go in the cold nights. If you have spent time in the backcountry, you probably already know what it is like to have your ear, for the woods start reassembling itself around an absence. The mail route had given me 31 years of early mornings on back roads, windows down through every season, and I had a reliable sense of what the country sounded like at different hours. What I noticed on the third morning, walking down to the creek to check the water quality before I filled the filter bottles, was that the bird traffic on the north side of the meadow was not where it normally was. Jays in particular. A late September morning in mixed timber at that elevation should have a constant low-level jay conversation going on in the larches and the big Doug firs, and there was none. The south side of the meadow was normal. The north was quiet in a way that felt intentional rather than incidental, the way the animals around my mail stops used to go quiet when a truck they did not recognize came down the road. I stood at the creek for a while, filling bottles and listening, and Pepper stayed closer to me than she usually did on open ground, which was a thing I filed alongside the quiet and the posture on the bench above the cabin. The evening of day 3, I went through another round of drops, twice daily as the discharge sheet required, and I noticed that I had been setting the bottles down in no consistent order since I arrived. 2 different small bottles of steroid drops, and 1 antibiotic, and they went wherever my hand set them. I picked them up and set the antibiotic deliberately on the right side, the way Darlene had kept it, and then I put it back the careless way, because copying her arrangement felt like something I did not have the footing for yet. Day 4 was clear and cold, the first real cold of the trip, frost on the boards before I was up. I split some kindling in the morning and stacked it beside the porch, and I walked the meadow perimeter in the afternoon and found a scatter of huckleberry stems where something had been feeding, the berries gone and the stems cleanly bent rather than broken, which suggests a careful hand rather than a foraging bear. Bears are not careful, are not. They lean into a bush and everything around the berries comes with. Whatever had been in those bushes had taken only what it wanted. I told myself it was probably deer. I knew it was probably not deer. Deer do not strip a section of a bush with that kind of selectivity. But I had a category I was willing to accept, and I chose to accept it. I want to acknowledge something. When I say that, I chose to accept the explanation. I mean that I knew I was accepting it. I was not confused. I've spent enough time in the field to know when a thing fits the pattern and when it does not. And I was choosing the pattern because the alternative required something from me that I was not ready to give. A grieving man alone on a mountain for the first time since his wife died does not want complications. He wants the days to be explicable, manageable. He wants to get through them. The morning of day 5, I came out the cabin door at first light to get water from the rain barrel beside the shed, and I almost stepped on it. A footprint, not mine. In the band of soft mud that ran along the base of the porch step, where the spring runoff had deposited a strip of fine silt that had held all summer and was just beginning to crust over. I crouched down and I looked at it for a long time. I had seen bear prints on my route for 31 years, from small black bears up to the occasional large grizzly that wandered down from the higher country. This was the shape of a foot, but it was not a bear. Bears have 5 toes and a distinctive heel pad, and the weight distribution is specific. What was in that mud was longer than my boot, which is a size 11, and it had a shape that was consistent with a foot, but not with a bare foot or a deer hoof or any other track I had a category for. The arch and the toe spacing were wrong for bear. The depth of the impression suggested a weight I did not want to try to calculate. I measured it against my boot anyway. I did it twice. The print was 8 inches longer than my size 11 boot. I stood up and looked at the tree line. Pepper was beside me, and she was looking at the same trees, her tail making a slow, low wag, not the bristled-back high wag of alarm, but the calm, rhythmic movement of a dog who has identified something familiar. I had no third rational explanation that I believed. That afternoon I stacked the rest of the kindling and made a pot of soup and tried to read, and I was aware the whole time that my attention was divided between the page and the north side of the meadow, which I could see from the window above the kitchen counter. Nothing moved across the meadow that afternoon. The jays were still absent from the north tree line. Whatever presence was organizing the quiet on that side of the property had not gone anywhere, and my nervous system had decided to monitor for it, whether my conscious mind was ready or not. The light went amber around 5 o'clock, the way it goes at altitude in late September, and I put on my jacket and went out to the porch with my coffee cup. Pepper came out with me and stood at the top of the porch steps, not sitting, just standing and looking north. The meadow grass was silver at the tips from the frost, and the aspens at the far edge had dropped 1/3 of their leaves, the remaining ones a deep enough gold to hold light past the point when the sky had given it up. I saw it at the tree line about 60 yards from the porch. I want to be precise here because precision is what I have to offer. I am not going to describe it in terms that make it into something from a story I read once. What I saw was large, larger than any man I have seen standing. The posture was upright and still, the arms longer proportionally than a man's arms are. The shape at the shoulder wide enough that my eye kept trying to reframe it as 2 things standing close together, before my depth perception overruled that and showed me it was one thing. Dark-furred or dark-clothed, though I have no rational reason to think clothed. The tree line behind it was lodgepole and fir, and the figure was in front of the trees, rather than among them, which told me it had stepped forward deliberately into the remaining light. I did not move. Pepper sat down. She sat down on the top step and faced it, and her tail made that slow, low wag, and she was utterly calm. 13 years old, half blind in one eye herself from age, and she was sitting there the way she sat when a neighbour she had known for years came up the walk. I do not know how long we stood like that. The light was going, the amber turning to grey, and the figure did not advance and did not retreat. It held its position with a steadiness that was not the stillness of an animal deciding whether to flee. It was the stillness of something that had decided already where it stood. I noticed in the middle of all this that I was not afraid. I want to be honest about that because it surprises me when I recall it. A rational man in his early 70s, 3 weeks out from eye surgery, standing 70 yards from something he cannot categorize. And what I felt was not fear. It was closer to the feeling of being addressed. The way you feel when someone calls your name in a crowd and you turn, and for a moment you cannot find the face, and you are standing in a state of pure, undecided attention. Then the darkness came the rest of the way up the meadow, and the figure was in the trees, and the meadow was empty, and Pepper stood up and went inside through the door I had left open, and I stood on the porch for another 10 minutes until the cold drove me in too. I did not sleep well that night, but not from fear. My mind was working in a direction I could not quite follow. I thought about Darlene. I thought about the track. I thought about the huckleberry stems bent clean and careful. I thought about what it meant for something that large to be that patient, that quiet, that particular, about being seen and not seen. At some point in the small hours, I thought about the eye drops, which is a strange thing to think about at 2 a.m. in a dark cabin, but I thought about them specifically. The 2 steroid bottles and the 1 antibiotic, set wherever I happened to put them down. I slept eventually, and I woke at dawn to the sound of the wood stove settling and Pepper breathing on the floor beside the bunk. I went to the kitchen to put water on for coffee, and I stopped. The eye drops were on the counter beside the soap dish. 2 steroid drops on the left, 1 antibiotic on the right. Caps forward, labels facing out. I had not arranged them that way. I had been careful not to arrange them that way because I had made a decision 4 nights earlier that I was not ready to copy her system. The bottles were where they had been the night before in the careless arrangement I kept, and now they were in Darlene's arrangement, the one she had used for 4 years, across 2 different procedures, the one she had explained to me once with the practical patience of a woman who understood that her husband needed systems made visible rather than assumed. I picked up the antibiotic bottle and set it down again in the same spot. I picked up the left steroid bottle and set it down in the same spot. I stood there with my hands on the cool counter, and I looked at those 3 small bottles for a long time. If you have ever had someone do something for you that was so specifically suited to your grief that it could not be coincidence, you know what that moment feels like, and I do not need to describe it further. If you have not, I am not sure I have the language to give it to you. It is not the warmth of a general kindness. It is the particular sensation of being known, of having been watched long enough, and with enough care that the watcher understood not what you needed generally, but what you needed precisely. The one small thing you had been refusing yourself because receiving it alone felt worse than doing without it. What was outside those windows had seen me not do what Darlene had done, had watched me set those bottles carelessly for 5 mornings, had understood in whatever way something that lives in the tree line understands the meaning of a human gesture, that I was avoiding an arrangement because the arrangement belonged to someone I had lost, and had made the arrangement for me, so that I would not have to be the one to do it first. I am not a person who cries easily. This is not a virtue. My daughter has told me gently, more than once, that it would be healthier if I were more willing to let things out. She is probably right, but I stood at that counter for a while, not quite crying, doing the thing that happens when the body decides to release something the mind has been holding sealed, the breath going uneven, and the chest doing what it does. Pepper came and sat on my foot, which is what she does. She has always done it. It was what Darlene did for me on the worst days, just sat close enough that the weight of her presence was physical, and Pepper had learned it from her. I did my morning drops in Darlene's arrangement. 2 on the left, 1 on the right. Caps forward. The north tree line was quiet when I went out to the porch with my coffee. Not the watching quiet of the past 4 days, but the ordinary quiet of an autumn morning when the birds have not yet started, and the frost is still on the grass. Whatever had been there had gone, or had at least stepped back to a distance that had no presence in it. I did not feel the watching anymore. I sat on the porch until the sun cleared the eastern ridge, and the meadow turned from grey to gold, and Pepper lay at my feet and slept. I drove down the mountain the next morning, packed the truck, closed up the shutters, swept the porch boards, banked the stove. I put the eye drop bottles in the small paper bag from the pharmacy where they had been sitting for 3 weeks, and I carried them to the truck carefully, which I had not done before. The drive home took 2.5 hours, and I spent most of it not thinking about what had happened, and then thinking about it in the careful, methodical way I approach things on my route when I was working through something, taking it apart, looking at each element, putting it back together and seeing if it still held. It held. I got home in the early afternoon and fed Pepper, and unpacked the food box, and put the drop bottles on the kitchen counter the way Darlene had arranged them, because I had found out that morning that I was ready to do that now. That doing it was not copying her out of grief, but honouring her out of something that had space in it. There is a difference between those two things, and I had not known the difference until someone showed it to me. I spent the next 2 weeks in a state that I would describe, if I had to describe it, as quieter than I had been in 8 months. Not healed, because that is not what had happened. Not resolved, just quieter, like the field after the weather has moved through. I did ordinary things. I mended the fence along the east pasture where 2 posts had heaved from the frost. I cleaned the gutters. I drove into town for groceries on a Wednesday, which was not my usual day for town, and I sat on the bench outside the hardware store for 20 minutes in the morning light, which was a bench I had been avoiding since January, because it was the bench where Darlene and I used to sit while we waited for orders to come in. On the first Saturday, 2 weeks after I came home, I called June. She picked up on the second ring with a sound in her voice that was ready for whatever I might need. The sound she had been answering my calls with since January. "Hey, Dad." "Hey," I said. "How are you doing? How are the kids?" There was a pause. Not a long one, but I heard it. "We're good," she said. "Evan lost his first tooth. He's been telling everybody." "First one?" "First one. He got $3 from the tooth fairy. He thinks that's how much all his teeth are worth, and we haven't corrected him." I laughed. A real one, not the polite kind. "Don't tell him yet," I said. We talked for an hour and a half. It was the longest call we had had since before her mother died. At some point she asked how the cabin trip had been, and I said it had been good, that it had been exactly what I needed. And she was quiet in a different way for a moment, and then said she was glad. I could hear in her voice that she was going to ask something harder, and she stopped herself, and I was grateful she did, because I did not have the whole story ready to give her yet. I still mostly do not, except that I have given her pieces of it over the months since, carefully, and she has received those pieces the way her mother always received the things I found hard to say, which is without pressing for the rest until I was ready. The morning drops became a routine again. 2 bottles on the left, 1 on the right, caps forward. I finished the post-surgery course on schedule, 4 weeks out from the second procedure, and then the bottles were empty, and I kept the arrangement with the bottles themselves on the counter for a while before I threw them away, because I was not quite ready to let the arrangement go. When I finally did throw them away, I found 3 new bottles from the refill I had filled at the pharmacy and set them in the same arrangement, and that felt right rather than hollow. Darlene had good instincts about organization. The arrangement was a good arrangement. It made them easy to find without fumbling, which was what she had designed it for. And I was 71 years old and still had morning eyes that were working out the difference between the two steroid bottles, and I was glad someone had thought to make it simple. I went back to the cabin in late October just for a day to close it up properly before the snow. Stuffed the pipes, drained the lines, covered the porch furniture. Pepper came with me, slower on the road than she had been in September, sleeping across my lap for part of the drive, in a way she had never done before. The north tree line was quiet when we arrived and quiet when we left. I walked the band of silt beside the porch step and looked for a long time, but the September rains had smoothed it out, and there was nothing to read there. I did not feel the watching, but I did not feel the absence of it the way I might have felt, the absence of something frightening. It was more like the way a meadow feels after a storm that was also a clearing, open and freshly scoured and oriented in a new direction. I stood at the kitchen counter one more time before I closed the cabin up and looked at the 3 small bottles I had brought up, the refill from the pharmacy sitting in Darlene's arrangement. 2 on the left, 1 on the right. I left them there on the counter. It seemed right to leave them. Whoever had been in that kitchen in the dark hours of an October morning had put them there once, and I did not want to take them back. Pepper sat in the truck when I came out, watching me through the window. Old dog on a cold mountain, half her face grey, one ear still leaning the wrong way after 13 years of trying to correct it. She wagged once when I got in. I drove down to the county road and turned south toward home, and the mountain went behind me in the mirror, and the larches were already bare, the gold all gone, and the high timber was dark and still and patient against the afternoon sky. Some things I have stopped trying to explain. Not because the explanation does not matter, but because I have found that the experience itself carries more weight when I hold it as a fact rather than as a puzzle. Something was up there, something that moved in the dark, without sound, and had been watching the cabin for at least 5 days. Long enough to learn a small, specific thing about a widower's morning routine. Long enough to understand what I was withholding from myself. Long enough to care about the difference. I do not know what it was. I have sat across from that question for months now, and it does not give me more than it gave me that September, which is the track in the mud and the quality of Pepper's calm, and those 3 bottles on the counter in the morning light. I was not raised to believe in things I could not demonstrate. My father was a practical man, and his father before him, and 31 years of a rural mail route does not build a person inclined toward wonder. But the world keeps going out past the edge of what we have accounted for, and sometimes in the places where we are quietest and most broken open, we get a glimpse of what is out there in the timber, watching in a way that does not mean us harm. It means us something. That is the most honest thing I can say. 2 on the left, 1 on the right, caps forward. Pepper at the foot of the counter. The morning light coming through the east window at a low angle and me standing in it, seeing clearly.